Good evening. Live from New York, it's Tuesday night. It's been a while since I said that. Welcome, everyone, to the April meeting of the Linnaean Society of New York. My name is Ken Chea. I'm the past president of the Society, and I now call this meeting to order. Well, spring is here. The birds are arriving, the trees are in bloom, and we have a very exciting presentation for you tonight. But first, a brief announcement or two. We have 10 new members of the Society, and I would like to welcome them now. They are Amy Chai, Catherine Crean, Jordan Douglas, Sheila Martin, Maria Mercurio, Judith Schechter, Laurel Nadler, Benjamin Smith, Jeffrey Train, and Joe Zimmerman. Welcome, one and all, to the Linnaean Society of New York. We're happy to have you, and I hope to get to meet some of you on future field trips. If anyone out there is listening and interested in becoming a member of the Linnaean Society of New York, we would love to hear from you. You can find all of the information that you need to apply for membership on our website. That's linnaeannewyork.org. LINNANEWYORK.org, linnaeannewyork.org. Well, our Tuesday morning Central Park bird walks are now underway, and they will be continuing through the migration season. If you would like to join us on a Tuesday morning in Central Park, or perhaps attend one of our many other field trips throughout the New York City area during this migration season, please go to our website and register for any of those walks that may interest you. And once again, that website is linnaeannewyork.org. There you will find all of our upcoming field trips, as well as a host of other interesting local birding information, such as the upcoming Great Gull Island Birdathon on May 10th and 11th. This is a really special and really fun event to participate in, and it provides critical support to the important study and protection of the tern colonies that nest each year on Great Gull Island. We hope that you will participate either as a birder or a sponsor or both this year. Remember, it's May 10th and 11th. Please check it out on our website. Well, I'm looking forward to tonight's program, and as usual, we have muted the microphones and disabled the chat. If you have questions for our speaker, Dr. Agrawal, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. After the program, our Vice President of Programming, Karen Becker, will moderate the Q&A, or someone will. We're working out a lot of kinks in tonight's program, but please stay with us. And now I'd like to announce our speaker. Dr. Anurag Agrawal is the professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and the Department of Entomology at Cornell University. He is recognized for his innovative contributions for academic biology, especially through providing conceptual advances and rigorous experimental work in the interactions between plants and the insects that eat them. He lives in Ithaca, New York, where he cultivates milkweed, watches monarchs, and studies their ecology. In his presentation of monarchs, milkweed, and the conservation of an iconic species, please welcome Dr. Anurag Agrawal.
Thank you very much, Ken. And good evening to everybody out there. Thank you very much for joining. I'm going to share my screen. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and to be speaking with you all. And as Ken said, I'll be talking about monarchs, milkweeds, and the conservation of this butterfly. And just to get right into things, here's the star of our show. And I think of the monarch, like all Lepidoptera, or all insects that go through a transformation, as fabulous transformers. And this monarch butterfly is just emerging from its chrysalis. It's going to pump its wings with its hemolymph and eventually turn into a butterfly. And as probably all of you know, the Lepidoptera split their life into two stages: a caterpillar phase, which is primarily a feeding machine, not very mobile, and also no mating going on. And then when they transform into the adult, like this monarch, they turn into that more mobile phase and that mating phase. On the plant side, monarchs interact quite strongly with the milkweeds. And this is probably the plant, the milkweed or Asclepias species, that's most familiar to you all. This is the common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, and certainly it grows throughout New York and the northeastern US. It's the most common of our local milkweeds. But as I'll talk about later, there are actually 140 species in this genus of Asclepias throughout the Americas, and monarchs can utilize basically all of them. Where are we in the annual migratory cycle of monarchs? So here we are in April. Monarchs are currently beginning their return journey. They're having their, what I call their first generation in the southern US. Monarchs this generation had started their lives as butterflies in August, and they migrated, those same individual butterflies migrated several thousand kilometers, found their way to mountaintops in Mexico, waited there for 3 to 4 months, flew back to Texas and the Gulf State, and are laying eggs and are caterpillars there. That one generation that lives 8 months is followed by 3 other generations that live 1 month each as they move north. And we're going to come back and go through a bunch of this as we move forward, but I wanted to just point out where we are in the annual migratory cycle. Now, I'm a professional biologist that studied monarchs for the last 20 years and hope for 20 more. But their biology has been studied for a very long time, certainly more than about 125 years. And in fact, one of the first entomology textbooks in 1904 by the Comstocks at Cornell University, they reported understanding that every fall monarchs were clearly migrating south, but that at that time scientists did not know where they went. They only knew that monarchs again reappeared in June and July the next year. And it was work that was pioneered by Nora and Fred Urquhart at the University of Toronto with a very large group of citizen scientists beginning in the 1940s that ultimately led to the discovery of the monarchs' migratory biology and their overwintering sites. Initially, they made their first report in 1955, having the summaries of hundreds, but only hundreds of North American citizen scientists reporting monarch sightings in different months. By 1975, with the help of thousands of citizen scientists, their overwintering sites and migratory biology was discovered by citizen scientists. And I say discovered here because, of course, the native people in the highlands of central Mexico, where the monarchs go to overwinter, knew that these butterflies were there in the winter. It's just that knowledge hadn't been connected with the scientific knowledge of their migratory biology. And folks, the discovery of monarchs overwintering in the highlands of Mexico, it wasn't reported, on Facebook or Twitter. It wasn't even reported initially or announced on the evening news. It was announced in the August 1976 issue of National Geographic. And here you can see one of the 2 citizen scientists, Kathy Brugger, who had basically some inkling of where they were and brought the scientists and then ultimately the National Geographic to the site. And you can see that her image in the colonies graces the cover of that issue. And if you look from the air, and we'll talk more about this later in the talk, what you see are these fir trees here in these highlands of central Mexico, and the orange that you see here is not dead leaves. It's in fact monarch butterflies that are so dense that they coat the trees, and ultimately they can be seen as orange. Now, just to give you some further background, the native range of monarchs is the Americas. We have the eastern North American population right here. There is a subspecies in northern South America, you can see here, and there's the California population of monarchs that's disjunct from the eastern population. And we can talk about that later, but these are the native range. But monarchs have been widely introduced, not on purpose. They are simply very, very, well, they're very abundant on the planet, and they move. Their old common name was the wanderer. And so anywhere milkweed has been planted, including Spain and Northern Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Hawaii, monarchs have ultimately colonized those places. In fact, some of you may know that the British have a very extensive knowledge of the lepidopteran fauna of the British Islands, and every 10 to 15 years, a monarch is reported in Britain, and and at first people thought, no way that's possible, but there's among the so many butterflies, there are some that ultimately do make it across the Atlantic, and so they've been introduced and are consuming milkweeds where they've been introduced around the world. So what I want to begin to transition to is starting to think about how we think about the interaction between monarchs and milkweed. And although when Alfred Lord Tennyson, he was a poet, wrote this line, "Nature is red in tooth and claw," he wasn't referring to biology or species interactions. He was referring to a lost friend, a friend who had passed away prematurely. But I like this quote because it summarizes in a way of the battle that goes out there between many organisms, and certainly between monarchs and milkweed. What I want to walk through with you next is kind of the natural history of coevolution. Coevolution is a special form of evolution where two species that are interacting evolve in response to each other. And we believe that monarchs and milkweeds, having shared a tremendously long evolutionary history, are exquisitely adapted to each other and have co-evolved over that time. Quite remarkably, every spring and summer, as monarchs move from the from Mexico and the southern U.S., as they're going to in the next couple of months, the play or the dance of that evolutionary history is played out in the behaviors and physiology and actions of the monarchs and milkweeds. And it starts like this, folks. It starts, these pictures were taken in Ithaca, New York. It starts, let's say, in mid-June, when monarchs are migrating back from the south, and eventually a mated female lays an egg on a leaf. The monarchs themselves, they're perennial the milkweeds themselves, they're perennial plants. They are re-sprouting from all of that underground biomass and rhizomes. And in about 4 days, that egg is going to hatch. The first thing most lepidopteran larvae do is they eat the chorion, or the shell of their egg, and then they go to the leaf and start to eat. In this natural history of coevolution, however, the plant is going to put forward sets of barriers, and each one of those is going to be overcome by the monarch. And the first barrier are the leaf hairs you can see right here. Trichomes, we call them, botanists call them. The trichomes present a physical barrier to feeding. And what the monarch will do after it hatches on its first day of life, it's 2 millimeters in length, is it basically has to remove that physical barrier. It's mowing the lawn. What you can see here on the leaf, I hope you all can see my pointer, is a shaved spot. The monarch caterpillar, before it can get any nutrition out of the leaf, it must remove that first barrier to feeding. The plant has put forward a defense, and the animal is shaving those trichomes before it can sink its mandibles into the leaf. So in the natural history of coevolution, there's a barrier and a response, the trichomes and the shaving of those trichomes. The next barrier to feeding is latex. Latex is one of these remarkable plant traits. It actually occurs in about 10% of all plants. So those of you that might know dandelion, that break the leaves, it produces a small amount of latex. Of course, the milkweeds do, and many of our food crops, papayas and figs, they produce that white sticky substance. On the left side here, you see a monarch butterfly, that caterpillar that's been killed. It's glued dead to the leaf after taking its first few bites of the milkweed leaf. The plant's second barrier to feeding is this pressurized series of canals that exudes latex upon damage. And folks, it's hard to overemphasize this, but this is a remarkably effective plant defense. 30 to 40% of all monarch caterpillars die in their first day of life when they become overwhelmed by a droplet of latex. In other words, in this coevolutionary dance, the plant has erected a second barrier to feeding, which is latex, that remains remarkably effective despite the fact that monarchs, as caterpillars, eat nothing else other than milkweed. But in the natural history of coevolution, every barrier is met with some counter adaptation. And what you can see on the right side here is this caterpillar is creating an island that is free of latex. It may take up to an hour or 2 hours of cutting the veins and letting the latex exude where it makes a cut, and ultimately go around in a circle to create a latex-free zone. The latex can no longer flow, and then it will consume that circle. Late in summer, if you walk through a field of milkweeds, you may find leaves that have 2 or 3 of these circles basically punched out, and you'll know that a first stage or a first instar monarch caterpillar had created that trench. As the caterpillars get bigger in their 4th and 5th instar or stage, they no longer cut little circles. They take to disarming the latex by cutting a deep notch in the midrib, basically the pipe which allows that latex to flow through the rest of the leaf. The caterpillar, again, might spend 40, 50 minutes cutting that notch. If it gets latex on its head, it'll rub its head and remove the latex, and it might quiver for a while if it's gotten some of the latex in its mouth. But ultimately, if it survives, it'll flip around and it might eat the rest of this leaf now in 10 minutes. It spends more time deactivating that latex than in consumption itself. In the natural history of coevolution, the second barrier is latex, and again, a behavioral response here to deactivate it. Now, milkweeds themselves and monarchs became famous in the 1960s and 70s because the plants are in fact toxic. They produce compounds that we call cardiac glycosides. These are steroidal compounds that function in part by attaching themselves to a very essential animal enzyme. It's called the sodium-potassium pump, and the details aren't important here, but the point that is important is that the monarch has genetic mutations in the genes that code for its sodium-potassium ATPase, or sodium pump, that render it largely, although not completely, but largely immune to the toxins of the milkweed. And in fact, the monarchs take things a step further, and they sequester, they pack those milkweed poisons into their bodies and into their wings as a defense against their own predators. This was famously shown by Lincoln Brower in the late 1960s, who used captive blue jays to demonstrate the toxicity that monarchs themselves have accumulated from the host plant, the milkweed. And in the textbooks of the 70s and early 80s, this became known as Brower's barfing blue jays, because quite repeatedly, 12 minutes after a blue jay consumes a monarch, it would vomit due to the toxicity of the milkweed's cardiac glycosides. Of course, being really smart animals, the blue jays then learn and avoid animals with that coloration, including the viceroy butterfly, which mimics the monarch in an evolutionary sense. If folks are interested at the end, we can talk some about the other birds, the grosbeaks and others that feed on monarchs with some impunity in the overwintering grounds in the highlands of Mexico. But for now, let's continue on with the life cycle. So we have that dance back and forth of trichomes and shaving and latex and notching those canals and producing of the poisons and having these physiological adaptations. For the monarchs that survive as caterpillars, they eventually take about 30 minutes to shed their skin and transform into a chrysalis. And I'd say there's many, many mysteries yet to be solved, for example, about the gold spots on the monarch's chrysalis. I think we understand something about how they're produced. That's a structural color. It's not a pigment, but their function, I would say, has not been yet identified. Then after 7 to 10 days, depending on the temperature, that chrysalis turns from green to black. And over the course of about 10 minutes, the monarch will drop out of its chrysalis, hold on to the casing, inflate its wings where we started this presentation, ultimately dry off, and then be ready for whatever its activities are, whether it's mating or migrating, etc. Folks, now as an adult, one of the things that I feel like is important to dispel is one of the myths about monarch butterflies. And one of the myths is that monarchs are important pollinators. That simply is not true in general for Lepidoptera. Lepidopterans, butterflies and moths, do some pollination, but really not very much. And certainly not nearly the amount that the Hymenoptera, the bees and wasps, and the flies, the Diptera, do. And in particular, important for our story tonight is that monarchs are essentially very poor pollinators of milkweed in particular. And that's important because it simplifies our understanding of their relationship. If the monarch was an important pollinator and also a consumer or herbivore or a parasite of the milkweed might be in some kind of dilemma. It needs to attract its pollinator, but it's trying to ward off its herbivore. But in this case, because monarchs are such poor pollinators of milkweed, it's really primarily a negative or an antagonistic relationship. Let me explain why they're not good pollinators of milkweed. You can see this large butterfly here is, it's so big that I feel like it's clumsily standing on top of the milkweed flowers. This is Asclepias tuberosa, or the butterfly weed. You can see it's extending its proboscis, or its mouth part, to drink the nectar from the flower. So it's happy to drink the nectar, of course. But milkweeds are special. They share a characteristic with orchids, which are two of the few groups, milkweeds and orchids, that don't present their pollen in free-flowing grains. They instead present their pollen in little packages. And those packages are called pollinia, and they're embedded in the side of one of the flowers. It's shaped like a wishbone, you can see here. And if I take a tweezers, needle-like tweezers, and pull out the pollinia, you can see that this is the package of pollen that is in the milkweed flower. In order to be pollinated, an insect has to climb over that flower, typically with spiny legs, and rub up against that black spot enough to pull out the pollinia, and then eventually go to another flower and essentially through accidental clambering all over the flower, insert the pollinia into the slit, which is right below that little wishbone. You can see here's an image of a honeybee, which has a pollinia attached to its leg. And what they do is they get onto the flower, they drink the nectar, they clamber all over them, and with their spiny legs, they pull one of those out. The monarch, with its big clumsy body, basically does not really come into contact with the pollinia. It's not pulling them out very often and not inserting them very often into the flowers. And as such, they are poor pollinators of milkweed. Again, the consequence of that is that they are primarily herbivores of the plant and not mutualists or pollinators. Okay, here we are in the life cycle again. This summer, we're going to enjoy, hopefully all of you will enjoy watching those eggs hatch and turn into caterpillars that shave the trichomes. And and turn into adults. And if we fast forward to August, in the Northeast, when monarch butterfly caterpillars in August get the cues of shortening day lengths, cooler nights, and old tattered milkweed leaves, and this has been studied, all three of those are critical cues, it stimulates a change, a physiological change in the monarchs that results in them being producing the migratory form. If they emerge or eclose from their chrysalis in late August or early September, that generation of monarchs will have much more investment in its musculature, larger wings, and they stay in what we call reproductive diapause. They don't mature their reproductive organs. Whereas the previous summer generations all would be have the smaller wings, less wing muscles, and would be maturing their reproductive organs right away. So when we see monarchs beginning in late August and early September, they begin that funneling process from across eastern North America, from southern Ontario, through the Midwest and the Northeast, ultimately mostly making their way to 12 mountaintops, the size of New York City in Mexico, about 50 kilometers from Mexico City. And I'll show you images of those in a minute. A very small number do make their way to Florida, and those that go to Florida become reproductive there, and there are year-round populations of monarchs in Florida, but the lion's share of them make their way to Mexico. This is what a scene looks like in southern Ontario in September. What you see is monarchs beginning to be a little bit more social, beginning to congregate. During the summer months, they're really not social animals, but in that last generation in August and September, the adults, when they emerge, they tend to form groups that will come down and feed on goldenrods in the afternoon. They'll then cluster on trees along the migratory path, because monarchs, they can fly about 30 to 50 miles a day, but they only fly during the day. So at night, they're going to cluster on trees, making their way for those 3,000 to 5,000 kilometers all the way to Mexico. And this is one of the mountaintops that they aggregate on. And the mountaintops are about at 10,000 feet of elevation. It's the Oyamel fir, which is the dominant tree that they roost on. And their roosting locations are often associated with these natural open areas that are called llanos in Spanish. And it's thought, although it's not been demonstrated, that they may be using these llanos, these open areas, as cues or as visual cues of where to overwinter and begin clustering on the trees. I'll just now show you a few images of monarchs in their overwintering grounds. They stay mostly clustered on trees, but when the temperature becomes about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, remember we're talking about 10,000 feet of elevation, so on sunny days in the winter in central Mexico, when it gets warm enough, they will take to the air, and they basically are going to streams to drink water at that point. There aren't a lot of things flowering at that point, so adult butterflies like these will basically drink water or flower nectar when it's available. It's an image I took in the overwintering colonies. You can see this is a fir tree that, again, does not have brown leaves, but has clusters of monarchs weighing it down. Again, when they take to the air, if we look up into the sky, you can see just spectacular flushes of the monarch from their aggregations, and you can hear their wings flap when you're there if you're quiet. This just returning to the image of the very dense monarchs on the firs next to one of these open grassland areas, llanos. And the reason I want to show this to you again is as we move forward in the talk this evening and talk further, I'm going to be mentioning issues relating to censusing the butterflies. These monarch butterflies in North America, there are hundreds of millions of them, and so understanding their populations sizes and their censuses is a very difficult problem. And there are many approaches that have been used, including summer butterfly counts, which I hope some of you have participated in. But the primary way that the entire population is censused is by the area of trees that are occupied during overwintering. So you can imagine this area, that this image I'm showing you, an area being calculated as I'm moving my pointer here, of the area of trees that are densely coated with monarch butterflies. And it's estimated that in 1 square meter on a tree that's heavily covered, that represents around 5,000 butterflies. And that's the primary way in which the World Wildlife Fund in Mexico does the annual census of the overwintering butterflies. We'll get back to that a bit later. Now, one of the things I just want to mention briefly here is that there's more to the insects on milkweeds than monarchs. And in fact, I get an email about once a month with somebody that writes and says, there are other insects that have colonized their milkweed, and they want to know how the milkweed should be treated so that we can get rid of those insects and make room for the monarchs. And I just want to say that the community of insects that has evolved with and specialized on the milkweeds is remarkably diverse and beautiful, and has every right, just as much right, to be there as the monarchs do. And I'll mention a few of these here. Hopefully some of you have seen these or you'll look for them this summer. But part of the neat thing to me is that despite the fact it's only about 12 species that have specialized on the milkweed, the common milkweed here in the Northeast, they've really taken advantage of all the different plant parts. So we have the monarch here, that's a leaf chewing insect. And then we have Tetraopes, the four-eyed milkweed beetle. It's in the Cerambycidae, or the longhorn beetle family. You'll notice it's also got the strongly contrasting bright coloration that's indicative of its toxicity. It too sequesters the milkweed poisons like the monarch butterfly. But it does most of its feeding as a larva on the roots. The eggs are laid next to the milkweed plants and grass stems. They hatch and drop to the soil, and they do all of their feeding and building of their body by being root borers. And then the milkweed has seed predators. This is the small milkweed bug, and this is the large milkweed bug. This is also the large milkweed bug over here, juveniles, and they are consumers of the seeds. So the seeds, the leaves, and the roots are consumed. And so is the phloem sap. There are 3 species of aphids, one shown here, the bright yellow Aphis nerei, and a 3rd species of aphid shown on the upper right that are all drinkers of the phloem sap. This weevil, a milkweed specialist, consumes the stem tissue, and this leaf beetle is another leaf feeder. Finally, milkweed also has one fly that is a specialist insect that feeds upon its leaves, and it's this little larva here, and it is a leaf miner. It feeds between the layers of the leaf. The adult female will lay its egg in the leaf, it hatches, and then it mines between the layers and gains some protection by being a feeder between the layers of the leaves. So it's a remarkably diverse community. This is a moth species, Eucades eglei, a more mature form, and this is its more juvenile, just hatched form. That all of these insects make milkweed their home, and they share a lot of characteristics, as you can see, in terms of their bright coloration, in part because they are taking advantage of milkweed's toxicity for their own benefits. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about this tonight, but one of the things that's occupied my own scholarship over the last 10 years or so is trying to understand how similar and different their strategies are in terms of exploiting the milkweed plant. And there's some very common themes. On the one hand, their coloration, as you can see here. Many of these species share the same genetic mutations that allow them to tolerate milkweed's cardiac glycosides. But there's also diversity in this group, and they do things differently as well. And that's one of the things that's been occupying my brain over the last decade or so. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, Asclepius as a genus named by Linnaeus for the Greek god of medicine, Asclepios. Linnaeus gave the genus the name in part knowing of the toxicity, but also the medicinal properties of the milkweeds. As I think probably all of you have heard this phrase, dose makes the poison. So many of our, whether it's botanical extracts or natural products, are both used in some doses medicinally by us, but also are toxins or used as poisons by the plant. And it takes knowing the appropriate dose to get that right. So the genus has about 140 species. Most of them are temperate species or subtropical. There's really just a few tropical species, which is quite interesting. And then the sister genus has about 250 species. It's called Gomphocarpus, and it's from Africa. That whole clade or that whole group is from Africa. They basically are indistinguishable in shape and form from Asclepius, the genus we have in the Americas. I'm showing you here some species, mostly from North America. Oh, this upper right species is African. And what you can see is they all have that specialized floral form of variants on that same form that it's been stretched and recolored over evolutionary time. But they all have that pollination system whereby a large-bodied hymenopteron typically is needed to pull out that pollen package and move it around. I'll just briefly mention the upper left here is Asclepias subulata, that's from Arizona, the butterfly weed, which probably some of you know, and there's some other lesser known species. This is the tropical milkweed, Asclepias curassavica, which is popular as an ornamental and has become feral, or some would say invasive, in the southern US and in California. And this is common milkweed again here on our bottom right. Okay, I want to turn for the last 10 minutes or so, and then I want to leave plenty of time for questions that you might have in this presentation on conservation of this butterfly. And I think whether you're a birder or an entomologist or just somebody that's out there taking in the natural history, you may have your own observations about whether monarchs, you see less of them in the last couple of decades or the last decade compared to earlier on. And that's what I'd like to address in this last part here. Folks, any way you slice it, monarch butterflies are declining. What I'm showing you here, this is really the only graph I want to show you, is a timeline, a census beginning in the early 1990s and ending just a couple of months ago, where each dot represents the yearly census taken by World Wildlife Fund Mexico of the area of forest occupied at the overwintering sites in Mexico. And there's really 12 prominent overwintering sites. The World Wildlife Fund looks at other places, and there's a few butterflies here and there, but the main overwintering sites are very well established. On the y-axis of this graph is the area of forest occupied in hectares, and the estimation is about 50 million butterflies per hectare. So what you can clearly see is the 90s represented a time when there was about 10 hectares of monarchs on average occupying the overwintering sites in Mexico. And through the 2000 to 2010, you might say the average is around 6. And since then, the average has sputtered around 2 to 4 hectares per year. Now, the good news, I suppose, is that in a statistical sense, the monarch populations have leveled off. There seem to be good years and bad years still, but the worst years for the monarchs were 2011 to 2014. Some of you will probably remember those were about some of the worst drought years we had, especially in Texas and northern Mexico. And what we understand now is that those drought years probably had a lot to do with the particularly dangerously low monarch numbers that were in those years. But even though we see the stabilization, I guess it's arguable the extent to which you think that's disastrously low or not. And that's something we can, again, talk about in the Q&A period if people would like to talk about that. And also to talk about the the petition to list monarchs as initially endangered and then more recently as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. I'd be happy to talk about that and what's happening with that and how people are. There's just some disagreement in the scientific community about whether monarchs should be listed or not, and we can discuss that. Where I'd like to end over the next 5 to 10 minutes is not giving you any data, but really giving you what I consider to be the lessons I've taken away from my own laboratory's work and a critical evaluation of the literature about understanding the causes of the monarch's decline. And the first thing I'd say is we simply do not fully understand the importance of what I call the disjunction between northern breeding regions and overwintering. Well, let me unpack that for you a little bit. The monarch butterfly has 4 generations a year, the eastern population that is east of the Rockies. And during the summer when we see them, they're in those kind of 2nd, 3rd, and 4th breeding seasons. Remember, each one of those butterfly generations only lives about a month from egg to death. But then that last generation that lives 8 months, that flies from New York all the way down to Mexico, waits there several months, and then flies back to Texas to lay eggs then. That generation basically is a pinch point or a bottleneck for the population, because even though there's 3 other generations a year, they all, not all, but the lion's share of them have to pass through that filter of overwintering. And each year, our own data from my own laboratory and those of others indicate that during the summer months, monarch populations increase. They increase from Texas to Indiana to Illinois and New York and Ontario, in part because there's several generations there, and each female can lay 250 to 300 eggs. So even those that are not dying in the latex or that are not eaten by predators, they're able, the excess allows the population to build over those 3 generations. And yet, by the time they get down to Mexico, we see that long-term trend shows a decline over the last 30 years or so. So we believe that there is an important loss that's happening in particular during the migratory process. And I just show you 2 images here. To the left, to me, that represents not necessarily agriculture per se, but let's just call it habitat destruction and all the things that go into industrial agriculture, including the habitat destruction. It's become very popular to have roadside milkweeds and to leave highway sides as only getting mowed every couple of years to encourage wildflowers. And I'm a proponent of that, absolutely. But what we've also know through some survey work by others, I haven't been involved in this work, but I did some extrapolation, and it's likely that 20 million butterflies die in car accidents every year during the migratory season. In other words, butterflies that hit a windshield and die. So it's not insubstantial, the amount of mortality that may be occurring through habitat loss, the lack of nectar plants in the agricultural fields, as well as in things like car accidents. The second lesson that I've learned from this work is that the monarch is a high fluctuation species. We know from tremendous amount of survey work and modeling now that regional climate is very important and that the decline has leveled off. This is only to say that there have been times in the past, and we actually know this from some work done in the 1950s by Nora and Fred Urquhart. There have been years in the past when it's been very difficult to find almost any monarchs. However, what we see now in the last, fully 15 years or so is that the population has, if you will, stabilized, but at a much lower level than population sizes in the past. So this is a high fluctuation species, and by having 4 generations a year, it's able to recover. We know that things like those extreme droughts Spring rains are really important for monarch abundance later in the year. So climate and climate change is likely to be quite important in the monarch's population fluctuations. Third, there is a very large role for parasites and predators in monarch populations, and links to monarch decline warrant further investigation. There are some sites where many citizen scientists have been monitoring, and these are pupae of a parasitoid, a tachinid fly that frequently lays eggs inside of monarchs. There are many places where essentially 99% or more of monarchs are killed by predators. So despite being so toxic, especially invertebrate predators, and there are spiders and stink bugs and parasitic flies and wasps, they are quite abundant. And there is some indication that the abundance and mortality due to these predators has increased over the last 15 to 20 years. Additionally, some of you may know about a protozoan parasite that we refer to as OE. Its abundance in the North American population has increased basically linearly from about 1% prevalent to over 10% prevalent over the last 20 or 22 years or so. So we don't really understand all of why these predators and parasites have been increasing in abundance, but they have been. Some of them are non-native. So a parasite that was introduced to control what's now called the spongy moth, formerly called gypsy moth, Lymantria dispar. That was introduced in the 1950s, and that's abundant in monarch caterpillars. So it was, there are non-native parasites and there are native ones, and they are having a relatively large impact. It is quite clear that pesticides are impacting monarchs, and it's not just insecticides, but it is also fungicides and herbicides that are impacting monarch populations. And I think we can all appreciate that insecticides in particular kill insects. That's what they're designed to do. But I think one of the more insidious aspects of pesticide use is that there are many sublethal effects that simply sicken insects or make them smaller, make them unable to make that thousands of mile journey. And so even if we can count an animal, that doesn't necessarily mean it is vigorous and is able to, for example, make its journey. There's strong evidence of sublethal effects and negative impacts of these various classes of pesticides on monarchs, but again, some of that is just emerging quite recently. And with the Birds and Bees Act of New York, which was passed in part through the hard work of Cornell scientists, neonicotinoids are being phased out of New York in general, and I think that is the beginning of good news for insect populations. The fifth lesson here is that planting native milkweeds will not hurt, certainly, but it will not solve the problem. For many years, the mantra that we had was plant milkweed and that'll help the monarch. And back in the days of the Obama administration, Michelle Obama here planted milkweed in the kitchen garden because they wanted to help the butterflies. And certainly, as long as we're planting native milkweeds from the regions that we're in, I think that's a positive thing to do, but it will not solve the problem. And I think that's just an important thing to recognize. And this is based on, again, data analyses and various things. But the indication is that milkweed may not be the limiting factor in terms of the monarch population. And kind of on a sober note, and I think where I want to end is the problem is bigger than the decline of monarchs. Many long distance migrations are in trouble. And monarchs are certainly not alone. And whether you're interested in migratory birds like tree swallows or sea turtles or other animals, it would appear that migrating animals are more sensitive or are in greater decline than non-migratory animals. And it's no wonder, right? Migration is both a stress and it exposes animals I think of monarchs as tasting their way from Ontario to Mexico as they go. They power that several thousand-mile journey through drinking nectar and turning that nectar into the energy they need to get to Mexico. So they're exposed to the environment and the environmental toxins or challenges all along that migratory route. Folks, I'm going to end there to leave plenty of time for question. I want to thank you very much for your attention. And I also just want to acknowledge, given the current federal cuts, that the work I've done over the last 20 years has been very generously supported by public dollars through the National Science Foundation. And the National Science Foundation has been such a critical fuel to the scientific greatness of American science, and I hope that it will continue. And again, thank you very much for your attention.
So one moment, this is my first day doing this, and so I'm a little clunky. So first question, do monarch butterflies have a navigational mechanism to find Mexico for overwintering?
Well, it's a great question. And as my colleague Stephen Reppert said, all migrating animals need a map and a compass if you want to find somewhere that you're going. And I'd say there are plenty of mysteries still, but there's some things we know. So for navigation, monarchs use what's called a time-compensated sun compass. And I'll explain what that means because it's just so great. The biology is really just wonderful. In order to orient south in September, the monarch needs to know that in the morning, the sun rises in the east. So in order to fly south, it keeps the sun, it uses the sun to navigate and keeps it on one side, whereas at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, the sun has gone to the western side. And so the monarch navigates, as do many birds and other animals, by using its internal clock, a circadian rhythm, with the position of sun. And that's how it flies south. Now, the mysteries, of course, are that Mexico, the overwintering grounds, these 12 mountaintops, are not directly south of, probably very few of the places that monarchs are flying from. And I'd say the additional cues that they use are not really known. They certainly follow, large bodies of water. They don't want to fly over, they don't really like to fly over a big body of water like Lake Ontario or the Gulf of Mexico. So bodies of water, and those of you that are birding on the shores of Long Island, that the butterflies kind of fly along the edge. And so in the fall. So we know that there's major features like the edges of water and mountains that kind of funnel them, and they have their time-compensated sun compass. But how they specifically get to the location that they're going and choose those overwintering sites that mystery has not been solved. There's some indication that magnetic meridians are utilized in a similar way as sea turtles, but it's certainly not the whole story. And then there's some speculation about magnetic rocks that are in the mountaintops where they overwinter that the monarchs are sensing and they're attracted to. But again, that's not been demonstrated conclusively. But the time-compensated sun compass is the compass. The map, I guess, is not particularly well known.
Lots more interesting research for the future. Are there other fir forests where the monarch can overwinter, or is the habitat in Mexico unique? I've heard that illegal logging is encroaching on their wintering grounds. Are these forests protected?
Yeah, great question. The forests are indeed protected, and the level of protection has increased since the early 80s. It's a World Heritage Site. There's the core areas which are protected, and then there's buffer areas. Now, over the years, there has been a substantial amount of illegal logging. And I think, as everyone can appreciate, there can be a tension between livelihoods and conservation. There doesn't have to be, but in those regions, there are certainly many people that live close by. Wood might still be being used for cooking or for heating. It's in the wintertime, and the forests are valuable. I mean, avocados are a controversial topic because they've been growing avocados higher and higher in central Mexico to feed American appetites. And so I would say that there are strong protections. There have been holes in the protection over the years. The current status seems to be pretty strong in terms of protections. Ecotourism is certainly an important thing for the livelihoods of local people, and so I think it behooves, it is seen as an important resource as well, the protection for ecotourism. But to answer the first part of the question, people have used what's called niche modeling to try to understand whether there are suitable sites even within that region of Mexico for monarchs to overwinter. And certainly there are other, suitable sites, but they don't seem to be using them. And with climate change, the OML firs, they have a very narrow band. I can't remember the specifics, but it might be between 9,500 and 10,200 feet of elevation where the OML firs grow. With climate change, there have been the warming in particular. The firs have been performing poorly in the lower elevations as it's been getting hotter, and they simply can't. They're not. This is just the case for all for all organisms, or not all, but most organisms. They're not able to keep up their own natural migratory pace up the mountains into the trees, so that perhaps the band might shift, let's say, to 10,000 to 10,700 feet. So there's an active forestation program where OML firs are being grown as seedlings and planted at higher elevations. But monarchs seem pretty sensitive to wanting to overwinter in pretty natural mature forests. And so I would say prognosis is not particularly good in terms of the overwintering sites. In terms of next 100 years, it's not clear to me the extent to which the mature forests are going to be at the right thermal band for both monarchs and the fir trees. But it's a kind of long answer, but I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
I'm curious about those cardiac glycosides. Is how or where they are sequestered different between caterpillars and adults?
I love these questions. Yes. I'm laughing at myself because I'm thinking, how much time do we have? I won't give you all the details, but what I will say, and this was actually some of the most important details were worked out by Lincoln Brower and their group in the 1970s. But in the adult butterfly, the cardiac glycosides are most concentrated in the wings, in the wing scales. And the thing about that that's so fascinating to me is they kind of, by doing so, they follow what I call the rules of sequestration. If you're gonna pack away a poison in your body, the first thing to do is to keep it away from your internal organs. Even if the monarch is highly resistant to those toxins, it's not completely resistant. So by putting them in the wings, it's away from the central organs. Secondly, the second rule of sequestration is put the toxins in a place where both a predator might taste them, but not necessarily kill the animal. And butterflies and moths can fly very well with pecks in their wings, and even with just 2 out of the 4 wings, they can fly pretty darn well. So by having the highest concentration of the cardiac glycosides in the wings, there's the potential for a predator to take a peck, decide it doesn't like it, to leave the butterfly live, and to go on. So we don't understand that much about during metamorphosis, how the cardiac glycosides are moved to being highly concentrated in the wing scales, but that's where they end up. There's a lot of current work, especially in Germany, happening right now by a former postdoc that worked in my lab, Gerhard Paczenska. He's trying to understand the initial part of the sequestration process of the caterpillar. What aspects are moving through the gut passively? What are being actively moved by transporters? To what extent is it in the hemolymph versus in the integument? And so some of that's being worked out currently. But yes, it is a really neat process that it mostly happens in the caterpillar phase, and then after metamorphosis, there's really not much more exposure to the cardiac glycosides as an adult. So it's basically then it's moved and it's there, yeah.
What role do you think organizations like the Linnean Society and its members can or should play in conserving monarchs and other insects?
Well, I guess I would say, 2 or 3 roles. I never, as a young person, I was never one of these people that worried about the demise of natural history knowledge. But as a upper middle-aged person now, I really do worry about the demise of natural history knowledge. So certainly, as a group of people that can appreciate organisms, I think sharing the magic is really an important thing that we can do. And frankly, this hasn't come up in questions, but I'm opposed personally on scientific grounds of mass rearing monarchs. Many people are out, like to raise hundreds or thousands every summer. I think they're trying to help the population, but I think that's a little bit misguided. We could talk about that later. But rearing a couple monarchs to share the magic with young people or with our neighbors, I think is a wonderful thing to do. And unlike most caterpillars, which feed at night, on the bottoms of leaves, and monarchs make themselves findable. They're abundant as caterpillars and as adults. And so I think sharing the magic, especially with young people, is something that we can do. And frankly, I've become a huge supporter of any organization that works towards preservation of natural areas. And so whether that's, giving of our time or of our money, I think it's really about education, I think, and then preservation to the extent we can. I don't think societies like the Linnean Society of New York, I don't think are that engaged in lobbying. I think that's the other thing we have to do. We have to stop being afraid of legislation. Like, legislation has become kind of a dirty word or whatever, but I think we absolutely need legislation. The Endangered Species Act and the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA and ESA, were enacted under Nixon's administration in 1973. And I think about how important, the Endangered Species Act is one of the most profound pieces of environmental legislation in the world, enacted under Nixon. So we just have to get back to some, anyway, sorry.
Thank you. Are there other species of butterflies also declining at similar rates to monarchs?
Well, that's a good question. Absolutely. And I don't like to say this too much and too loudly, but the monarch butterfly is not a model insect for conservation. It's a weedy butterfly. It gets around. It's the wanderer. It's colonized Hawaii. It's colonized New Zealand. It's a very, very flexible animal. In Australia, it has a migratory pattern that's completely otherworldly than it is in the native range. So yes, monarchs are declining, but there is from my perspective, there's zero chance of extinction. There are many, many butterflies, insects, moths, beetles, flies that are going extinct every year. And certainly many on the endangered species list. So I would say monarchs are an excellent icon. They're an excellent vehicle. They're the polar bear, or as May Berenbaum says, the Bambi of the insect world. So I think they're important in terms of their power to communicate with people about invertebrate or insect conservation. But yes, there are many, many other insects and butterflies that are in more dire straits than monarchs. Oops, you're muted. I'm sorry.
That brings us back to a question that you alluded to earlier, which is, do you think that they should be listed as threatened?
You know, on scientific grounds, I would say no. I've come to sort of if it seems like the Fish and Wildlife Service has entertained listing monarchs twice. And they have both times said that listing is warranted, but precluded because of higher priorities. So, I'm willing to go with that if it raises awareness and it encourages people. But I don't know how much of the listing is warranted but precluded designation that the Fish and Wildlife Service has come to is based on symbolism versus actual, worry about threats and extinction. I would say I guess I agree with the Fish and Wildlife's conclusion in the sense that there are higher priorities. But there is, in my opinion, sorry. There's no probability of extinction. I mean, there's year-round monarchs in Florida. I mean, the lowlands in Mexico, people don't talk about this, but you can hike around or drive around in Mexico. It's a giant country and find monarchs almost anywhere, any time of the year in the lowlands. So, sorry, go ahead.
So does that mean there's other appropriate habitat in Mexico?
Yeah,
that's not being used or being used minimally?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We think of monarchs, I paint this sort of relatively simple picture of hundreds of millions of breeding butterflies east of the Rockies that all funnel down to these 12 mountaintops. But in truth, there are some non-migratory monarchs in Florida and in the Gulf states, and from northern Mexico down to the Yucatan. I mean, I don't know that there's data, but we could probably all get on iNaturalist and look at the abundance of caterpillars or adult monarchs, and I'm guessing we'd find them in most states in most parts of the year. So there's milkweeds they're not the species we have here, but they're appropriate, meaning food plants, Asclepias food plants that are usable, and the monarchs use them. I don't know whether that's a kind of a human-created scenario or whether it's been that way, pre-Pleistocene. I just don't know to what extent human activities and disturbance has generated that large population of non-migratory Mexican butterflies.
Are monarchs the only butterflies that perform this staged migration?
Wow, I should know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, there are many migratory butterflies, but I'm trying to remember if they are staged in that way. In other words, multi-generational. One of the things we like to talk about is how do they know, when they're in Texas, how does that generation know to go north as opposed to the ones that go south? And some of those mysteries are like temperature cued and that kind of thing, but I'm not sure. We're still discovering a lot of insects that are migratory. Dragonflies, I think it was just in the last 10 years that it was discovered that the dragonflies that we see, flying south along the Jersey shore in the fall, we didn't know where they went until about 10 years ago. But I believe in that case, it's the same individuals that go to Florida and come back, which seems hard to believe from a different perspective that they have the machinery to do that. I don't know if there are other staged multi-generational migratory butterflies.
The next question, thanks for a great talk. You showed the data of monarchs declining in the overwintering range. Is it possible they are declining from the area where the data were gathered because climate change is driving their overwintering range further north?
Can you say that last part again?
Is it possible that they are declining from the area where the data were gathered because climate change is driving their overwintering range further north?
Yes, I mean the reduced suitability of the overwintering habitats, I think is certainly a possibility, and especially because it's a relatively narrow band. And what I didn't talk about this, and this is again classic work of Lincoln Brower's, is that when they're overwintering for 3 or 4 months, it's a very delicate balance of if it's too warm, they end up being metabolically active and they burn their energy and aren't able to make it back to Texas. If it's too cold, they freeze. It's a tropical butterfly. I mean, it's not able to withstand freezing. That's in part what's driven the migration. So their thermal performance over several months is dictated in part by being at the right temperature. So yes, I think that is a possibility, or a contributing possibility.
You mentioned other birds, grosbeaks, and others eating monarchs. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, there are two bird species, the black-headed grosbeak and an oriole, and I'm embarrassed talking to you guys that I can't remember, even though I've written about them. They are also migratory birds, and I think they certainly eat millions of butterflies in the overwintering colonies in Mexico. And there's a bunch of really great biology known about them. First off, they don't eat the most toxic parts, so they clip off the wings, they slice open the abdomen, and they lick out the body parts inside. But so they have all these behavioral adaptations, and there's mice, and there's 3 species of mice in the overwintering grounds that do something similar. They prefer to eat males over females, and that comes out in the data. Males sequester less toxins, and so they go for the males. I'd say the biggest innovation that we've understood in the last 5 years or so about them is, and I think it's just the grosbeak for which this is known, the oriole has not yet been studied in this way, is that among the 3 mutations that monarchs have that make them insensitive to the cardiac glycosides, that black-headed grosbeak also has one of those 3 same exact genetic mutation. And it's a little shocking because it's the person that did that work showed that that mutation doesn't exist in the 100 or so other passerines that have been sequenced. So it's not just that all birds in that group have that same mutation. So it would seem that some of the kind of adaptation to the toxins has trickled up the food chain to one of its major bird predators.
Concern for the pain suffered by insects used in research has recently been expressed. Do you have an opinion about whether that pain should be mitigated if possible, even if it hinders the research?
Boy, I can only give you my personal opinion, and I guess I'd say no. But I can see the arguments, and I would say my personal opinion is I don't know where we would draw what line. Predators that have evolved to be predatory should be allowed to kill their prey. And I guess I would say, my position would be for insects that rearing them for research should not be limited. I'm not sure what the evidence for pain and suffering is either. And I guess I don't want to get into that, but yeah.
But this sounds it's alluding to a novel whose name escapes me, but we know that monarchs aggregate in coniferous forests on 12 Mexican mountaintops. Are there specific regions or habitats in the eastern US where monarchs aggregate?
Sure. I mean, in the California populations, it's a much smaller population of monarchs, but they aggregate on trees on the coast, and famously in Monterey, California. It's quite interesting in the sense that they mostly aggregate on eucalyptus trees there, which are not native. And so, I think it's not known to me the history, what they were using and what those habitats are exactly like pre-eucalyptus, but that's their favored tree to overwinter on. In other places like Australia, where they have a migration and overwintering phase, they are overwintering on other species there. It is interesting in that in the OML fir forest, there are other trees. It's not a monoculture of firs. And so the exact properties, physical or chemical attractants, have not been exactly worked out in terms of why they prefer certain things versus others. But certainly fir trees and eucalyptus trees have certainly an odor that I could imagine being involved in that way. And yeah.
You talked a little bit about this before, but there's a question about people who raise and release monarchs. I understand that these monarchs do not migrate and can actually cause harm.
Yeah, there's some evidence, published evidence that caterpillars that are reared indoors in particular are less able to orient south in the fall, and maybe they have different size or wing musculature. I would say my objection to mass rearing of monarchs is, I think, several fold. One, it has to do with that. Another is disease tends to propagate in crowded conditions and mass rearing. And so, monarch adults avoid laying eggs on plants that already have one egg on them. They can sense another egg and they try to pick another plant. As you increase the density from 1 to 2 to 5 to 10, they appear to be agitated, they bite each other a little bit, and we know from just many, many studies that disease transmission increases. So that's not something we want to, I think an inadvertent negative consequence could be spreading disease. And then I think that, lastly, I understand, I want to help, we all want to help, but, I think to me, it's a little bit analogous to, you have a sink that's leaking and water is draining out of the sink, and you're just trying to add some droplets into the sink to help retain the water, or the monarch population, as it were. And I just think it's not effort that we're never going to be able to keep up with the leak unless we solve the real problem, unless we solve the real problems.
You said that milkweeds were not really a rate limiting step here, which kind of surprised me. Number one, because the Hymenoptera that pollinate them are not doing so well, especially with all of the chemicals that we're exposing them to. And I guess part B of that question, no, it's not a part B. That's a question.
Well, I guess one of the things I'd say is where there is milkweed and where there are monarchs, they aren't defoliating the plants. You tend to find less than one monarch per plant. So it certainly is the case that over large swaths of land, especially that which has been sterilized by herbicides, there are simply no host plant. And if there's monarchs flying there or in that direction, they're not likely to find host plants. But those aren't the places that we citizens are planting milkweed in order to increase their populations. So if I think about the Northeast that I know, let's say most of New York State, that's not very urban, there's enough milkweed there for the monarchs, and the population, the abundance of the animals, I think, tells that story. The fact that monarch populations seem to build over the summer, over their 3 generations, again, tells you that at some level, it's not milkweed that's limiting their population.
Well, thank you so very much, Ken. I'm not sure if you are, um, a hello from Cheryl Craddock. I was on the OTS course in 95 with you. No worries if you don't
Wow.
remember. It's been a minute. Thanks for the thought. Um, Ken, I'm not sure if you're coming back to us.
No, you're on your own.
Oh, all right. I'm sorry. As I said, this is the
but-
first time I'm doing
But
this.
since you have me, I just want to thank you, Dr. Agrawal, for a wonderful talk, and how exciting it is to hear news of various other taxa besides birds. We have a lot of people in this society. I'm a bird and an insect person, and I
Wonderful.
really enjoyed your talk. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Thank you so very much.
I think we're good to close. Do you want to take us out, Karen, and say good night?
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. Goodbye.